Hello, my dear patrons, and thank you all so much for tuning in to this month's 60-minute oil painting tutorial, in which I'll show you how I painted this realistic portrait. As usual, let's start with the color mixing demo. Alrighty, so these are the colors I used for this portrait. We have ivory black, raw umber, burnt sienna, bohemian green earth, cobalt blue, cobalt teal, alizarin crimson, cadmium red medium, cadmium red light, raw sienna, cadmium yellow medium, nickel yellow, and titanium white. And for my medium, I'm using a mixture of oleoresin gel and linseed oil. So let's start with the basics. The background is just pure ivory black. And in the shadows, I had a mixture of ivory black with some raw umber. And for certain parts of the shadows that were redder, I would incorporate bits of alizarin crimson or perhaps cad red medium, depending on how warm or cool I wanted the red to be. I'm going to add some more raw umber in here as well. Some more ivory black to darken the value a bit. Also, depending on where the darkest values were, some of the shadows were cooler. So some of the shadows actually had a bit of bohemian green earth and a touch of cobalt blue in them to make them like a colder greenish shadow. And as usual, I'm making these kind of strings of color puddles on my palette so that I can see how the colors look laying next to each other. It's almost like a test or experiment area before I lay the colors down on the painting itself. I can test it out here. For the midtones, by the way, I'm just kind of wiping my brush. I don't really need to dip it in Gamsol as often as I thought. Being at school has taught me that sometimes all you need to do is wipe it. So midtones, we'll be seeing more burnt sienna, more raw sienna. Of course, you know, this is far too orange, so some parts had a bit of cooler tones with the bohemian green earth. Sometimes I would lighten it with a bit of the nickel yellow, and if that looked too green, I would add a touch of cad red medium to cool it down. Red and green, when mixed together, make different types of browns. So I always like to utilize reds and greens in my skin tones. Some of the midtones, you'll see a punch of pink. There's a rosiness to it. For those parts, I started off with cad red light, some cad red medium, and I would use cad yellow medium, and this would create a very vibrant kind of orange color. Some of the transitions from dark to midtones, I would just squeeze in a little transition color, like let's say right here. I'd squeeze in a little bit of orange, or sometimes like a pop of orange right here. In these transitional areas, you can squeeze in a bit of extra chroma. So the pinks are going to be more cad red heavy, and sometimes I'll lighten it with nickel yellow to create a nice kind of peachy pink. For the nose and the cheeks, sometimes you use a bit of the titanium white as well. That'll cool down that pink significantly. Let's see, the beard is really fun. The beard, sometimes I would start with some ivory black and some titanium white just to get like a nice kind of mid-tone gray started. But you don't want it to be just pure gray, because that is such a jump in level of saturation and in temperature. All of these other colors have a lot of chroma to them, and you don't want the beard to just be all of a sudden devoid of any chroma. So instead, I just mix colors that I see in the skin tone. So let's start off with the shadowy parts of the beard. I would often have parts of raw umber into the gray, sometimes bohemian green earth into the gray. This color almost blends in perfectly with my palette. And then other areas, it would be a bit bluer, sometimes maybe a bit of cobalt teal, some raw sienna to make it a bit greener. This is getting kind of hard to see, but yeah, they're just very close to the color of my palette. And as the beard gets lighter, I usually tend to lighten it with nickel yellow and titanium white, and sometimes I'll add a touch of the raw sienna for the, I guess, midtones of the beard. Here, as we mix colors into the shadows of the beard, we can see them a bit better. And then for the highlights of the beard, I like to add punches of cool notes. So some cobalt teal, some titanium white. That is a bit too blue and too abrupt of a temperature shift, so I'll add in some nickel yellow. Oh, that is way too yellow. But not to be afraid, we can add some bohemian green earth and some more titanium white, and see that I'll tone that right down. And color mixing is all about just fine-tuning things little by little, experimenting, adding a bit more blue to get it cool, and if it's too cool you can add a bit more red or yellow to warm it up. Experimenting and trial and erroring until you find the right color. And let's see, for his eyes, he has beautiful blue eyes, so I usually had a bit of cobalt blue for the shadows, cobalt teal for the highlights, and of course I would tone these colors down with like some raw umber, some ivory black. Usually I work wet on wet, so while the eye whites and bottom layer has more of these brown and neutral tones, if I just lay down the blues on top, it tend to integrate it in very nicely, and it wasn't too jarring. And then lastly, I guess for his cloak, which is very abstractified, I did a combination of burnt umber and burnt sienna with a touch of bohemian green earth, depending on, I guess, which patch I was painting. For the shadows, it was ivory black. So yeah, that's kind of my color palette for this portrait in a nutshell. Once again, to reiterate, color mixing should be a fairly intuitive, fun process. I would recommend not always forcing yourself to stick to like a specific recipe or a specific ratio of, X amount of this color plus Y amount of that color equals like this perfect end result color. Every time I reload my brush, I'm pretty much remixing colors. It's okay to spend a lot of time on your palette. It's okay to try things out and have some things work and some things not. But just use your palette as kind of a testing ground to put colors next to each other, see how they look in relationship with one another. Load your brush up with a certain color and then hold it up in front of your painting before you deposit the paint, just to see how that new patch of color is going to look against your current colors. I realized in art school that if we take our time with each individual brush stroke, then the overall painting process is actually faster. But if we rush through the individual steps, it'll just cause us to make mistakes and cause us to spend even more time repainting and problem solving. So don't be afraid to take your time with color mixing, play around, and just follow your intuitions. If a color is too cool, you can warm it up with like a red or a yellow. If a color is too warm, too orangey, you can tone it down with some blues. It's complementary. Complementary colors make green. Like there's so many of these intuitive, I guess, color mixing rules that you'll naturally develop just as a form of muscle memory as you experiment with this more and more. So, okay, I will stop rambling now. Let's move on to the painting demo.
Okay, finally starting with the painting demo. Real quick, I'll just go over my supplies. I am painting on oil paper. I'm using the Stonehenge brand, and I bought a pad that contained, I think, like 12 or 15 sheets. They measure 12 by 16 inches. And the cost was, I would say, $1.50 to $2 per sheet. I'm not quite sure, but I've been a big fan of painting on oil paper for class because painting is costly, and I just didn't want to pay for like a gesso board panel for every exercise we do, because sometimes we'll go through like 5 or so of these sheets of paper a week. And if I were to pay like $10 to $20 for a panel every time, it would just be insane in terms of cost. So I think oil paper for me is a great alternative to canvas pad, which is something that some of the other classmates use. So for these kind of exercises where we're not making giant, epic, finished concepts, I try to find more cost-effective solutions. And the reason why I like the paper is because it is more absorbent than canvas, and it has like a beautiful, smooth paper texture that I find more pleasing to the eye than the woven canvas texture. But different strokes for different folks. No shade on anyone who likes canvas. I know that some people really love the texture, and that's cool too. But for me, I prefer paper, and I like to first prime the paper with one layer of acrylic gesso. The paper comes pre-primed already, and they say that it's ready to go, straight out of the package. But I like to just add one more layer of primed gesso, just to reduce the absorbency rate, because without it, the paper on its own is quite absorbent, and it becomes frustrating to paint with at times because the paper soaks up the paint so quickly, and it'll cause the paint to be sunken in, which results in the colors basically like getting absorbed into the paper and drying kind of matte. So to circumvent that, I just prime it with one more layer of gesso, and that seems to reduce the absorbency rate and get it to a very workable state. After that layer of gesso is dried, I just taped it to a hard board. I think this is just the back of a picture frame that I didn't need. And I toned it with, I think in this case, it was some burnt sienna and some burnt umber. Usually I would go for a less orangey tone, but in this case I had some paint left over on my palette that I didn't want to waste, so I just toned it by mixing the leftover paint with some Gamsol and using a paper towel to kind of wipe it onto the paper. I started off freehanding the portrait. I like just sketching with oils instead of sketching with pencil and then transferring it. I like to jump into painting as quickly as possible because I'm always eager to paint. But some of the other students and our teacher as well, they like to spend some time to draw the block in, get all the proportions and anatomy correct, and then they'll transfer the drawing onto the painting surface, which is a very valid method and would probably give me a lot more accuracy. But for me, I tend to just sketch it with oils and refine the block in and proportions as I paint. So you'll see me later, and I'll be sure to bring this up when we get to that point, but later I will actually fix a few of the proportional anatomical issues, which is, I guess, the one drawback to just blocking in with paint is you don't get that accuracy. But I kind of like just having a painting beginning to end with no other mediums, if possible. Like I try to not have pencil or charcoal transfer lines. I think there's something really fun and raw about having just pure paint on a painting surface. And for the initial light sketches, I was using a combination of raw umber and titanium white that I thinned with Gamsol. And I would just apply like a thin wash of it onto the panel. So sometimes I would dip my brush in Gamsol, load the color onto the brush, and then I would wipe it, like very lightly dab excess paint off on a paper towel before I paint with it. That way I get a very thin, controlled application. With this initial sketching stage, it's important to not have too much Gamsol or too wet of paint because it can start running and behaving like watercolor, and it becomes hard to control. So even though I'm thinning out the paint, I'm still not using a large quantity of paint. I'm still reducing just the amount of paint on my brush. Well, in this case, it's paint and Gamsol mixture, but you know what I mean. Just not a lot of stuff on the brush so I can lightly layer it on and creep up to the level I want instead of dealing with an overwhelming, huge amount of paint right off the bat. By Using less paint initially, I can also slightly darken the lines as I triangulate on where their accurate positioning is. So as I get more confident, I will apply less Gamsol and more of the raw umber, or I'll tone down the amount of white I use and just gradually darken the lines as I finalize their positioning. And then once I finalize the lines, I just went in with a light wash of this burnt umber titanium white mixture to block in all the shadow shapes. And after that, I went in with pure titanium white to scumble in the highlights and lighter values. So I'm starting off my painting with already some bulkiness of paint application in the highlights and midtones. In class, they always teach us to keep the shadows thin and airy and to crank up the texture and thickness of paint in the lighter tones and highlights. So by starting off with like a thin wash of the shadow shapes and then a thick scumble in of white paint on the highlights and lighter values, I hopefully can set myself off on the right foot. And, you know, one of the things I struggle with in class is, I guess I wouldn't say struggle, but one of the things I want to work on improving is my paint application. My teacher says I tend to apply my paint too thinly, and it results in just this effect of almost like you're not looking at a physical oil painting. It could almost pass for like a print, like a canvas print of a digital painting. And so my teacher really wants me to work on being more bold and applying thicker paint and sculpting with the paint. You know, when you apply paint thickly enough, it becomes like a 3D, almost like a clay type of medium. So it's not like watercolor, it's not like gouache, it's not like ink or drawing or digital painting. It's a 3D globby medium that you can use to flatten or create peaks and valleys, or to blend out certain areas and leave thick dollops in other areas. So my teacher really wanted me to, with every new piece I do, focus on slowly acclimating myself to thicker paint application. I know it's not something I can do overnight. You know, it's really hard to change the painting habits and to change your muscle memory that you're used to, especially if you've been painting for many years. But, you know, it's going to be like a slow, gradual process, which, you know, I'm excited about. I think with most things, it's important to be patient with yourself, and whenever you try out a new technique, you know, at first it's always going to be new and uncomfortable and a little bit awkward, and you might make mistakes and things might not turn out super pretty, or they might not be at the same quality that you're used to. But, you know, for me, that's just a part of the learning process. You have to fail before you can succeed. So I just try to crank up the paint thickness a little bit each time instead of trying to fix it overnight. And after that initial underpainting and scumble in, I reinforced the darker shadows with some raw umber mixed with alizarin crimson. I guess I won't talk too much about the exact colors I used, since I did talk about that during the color mixing demo, but it never hurts to reinforce some of this knowledge. And after blocking in the dark shadow shapes, I am just starting off with that left eye and working my way from left to right, and using a technique I guess they call window washing or window shading. Sorry, not window washing. I always get that mixed up. Window shading is where you start with like one origin point and you try to render things as completely and as fully as you can, and then working your way out from that starting point. So I started off with that left eye, and now I'm realizing that the paper just looks far too orange, and I want to establish like a dark black tone near that left part of the face so that I can visually calibrate not only the colors I'm mixing, but also visually calibrate my value hierarchy. With painting, it's so important to pay attention to values. Our teacher say? He says the values and the block-in are final and the colors are flexible. So what that means is your block-in is where you draw in or sketch in the composition, the placement, the proportions, the anatomy, that you have to pay a lot of attention to, because once you lock that in, you can't really change it that much. You can make small refinements and small nudges, but it's very crucial to get that block in and the proportions as accurate as you can right off the bat. And then your values are also something that's final and unmovable. So you want like your highlights, midtones, and dark values to all be in the correct place, to be at the correct intensity. Values are what gives the illusion of form, of the 3D-ness of your form. It also gives you information as to where the light source is, how intense that light is. And for me, one big difference I noticed in my work prior to being trained at the atelier versus, my work after being trained at the atelier is I pay so much more attention to values now than before, really having those dramatic dark shadows, playing with, intense contrast against the really bright highlights, and then all the values in between falling in their correct place on the value spectrum or the value hierarchy. So those two are things you should really pay attention to and try to get perfect. And there's kind of like a universal standard for having a good block in and good value structure. But color is where you have a bit more flexibility. Some students might choose a more muted, toned down color palette. Other students might choose to push the vibrancy and saturation and chroma. Some students like to skew more warm and paint with warmer colors. Other students like to use cooler tones. So in color is where you can see a lot of the artist's individuality shine. For me, I started off being pretty heavy-handed with the color. I was using almost like, I guess, Lisa Frank level rainbow colors. I like to push the saturation. I like my paintings to be really vibrant. And my teachers told me to try to tone it down, play around with the neutrals and get the colors looking more like what we see in real life. So if there's sometimes like if I see blush on a cheek or on the nose, instead of going like full red or full pink, just try toning it down with some complementary colors. Like try mixing those reds with some greens and, making them look more natural and more neutral. So that's something as the year goes on, I've been really loving is playing around with a more muted, subtle color palette and letting there be a few opportunities where I can push the chroma, but not letting that be the standard all across my entire painting. And I realized that by using more neutrals and muted colors and giving myself only small accents of intense saturation, it actually makes the overall painting feel more colorful and more alive. If I put down intense levels of saturation throughout the painting consistently, then all those saturated colors are fighting for attention and fighting for the spotlight, and they kind of just end up drowning each other out. But by having mostly muted, desaturated colors, those few super colorful accents really have a chance to shine and to stand out. And I think that's what makes the painting look interesting. And they say this, with everything, not just color, like with values, with the softness of your edges. You want to have variety. You want to have a hierarchy. And you'll hear me say this in every single Patreon tutorial video. And I know I may sound like a broken record. I'm being very repetitive, but I truly do think this is like so important to reiterate every time. You don't want like all of your edges to be extremely soft and fuzzy. You want some edges to be blurry and soft and other edges to be sharp and refined. In this portrait, I'm trying to keep like the edges of the outer contour of the head, like the edges that touch the background. I try to keep those soft and blurry so that it looks almost like a camera lens that's out of focus. Or I guess like when you think of a camera with, like when you take a picture of someone's face, maybe their eyes and their nose are in focus, but like their ears or the outer edge of their head is not super in focus. The parts that are far away from the camera lens will be slightly blurry, and the parts closer to the camera lens where we have set the focus to be will be sharper. So I try to convey that in my edges. I try to think of my eyes almost as a camera lens. So, for example, the outer edge of his beard, even though in person I see it as sharp, I still try to interpret that and change that sharp edge to be soft on my painting, reserving the hard edges for the high impact areas like the wrinkles on his eyes or his nose. And values too. Values, there should be a hierarchy. There should be some lights that are grouped together, and then some areas where you have a densely packed spectrum of different values. So I know that with the eyes, the eye bags, the nose, the eyebrows, those are areas where we see a lot of dramatic contrast, and that's what kind of creates the expression. So I will keep the detailed as faithful to what I see as possible, like really taking the time to render every last wrinkle, taking the time to make sure that the shadows on the wrinkles make sense, placing, intense dark values right next to intense light values. It creates that dramatic contrast. But for areas like the forehead or the top of the head, I can do a bit more of simplification. I can take some similar values that are sitting next to each other and decide to group them into just one single value. And by doing that, by having that hierarchy of, some areas where the values are simplified and grouped together, and other areas where the values are, very meticulously rendered and have high areas of contrast, that's also what creates that interesting visual hierarchy. So your eyes are immediately drawn to his eyes and his, the wrinkles on his eyebrows and his eye bags. And then our eyes will not linger too long on his forehead, where I've simplified and grouped the values together. Same with the shadows, the shadows on the right side of his face. You won't be able to see a lot of the details in those shadows because I've grouped them together to bring out the focus to the center of his face, where we see the most expressive wrinkles and facial features. So yeah, your edge quality, your values, your colors, they all need to form some sort of hierarchy. You need to have some variation. Nothing should be completely consistent throughout. You have some areas that are sharper edges, some areas that are softer edges, some areas where the values are intense and have high contrast, and other areas where the values are simplified and grouped together. You also, have obviously the spectrum of some areas will have darker values and some areas will have lighter values. And same with the color. You have some areas where the color is really saturated and chromatic, and other areas where the colors are muted and toned down. So by implementing a spectrum, or by ranking all of these characteristics from the most intense characteristic to less intense characteristic, and also varying the degree at which you apply these characteristics throughout, you really end up with a painting that's full of life, full of this organic quality, right? Real life is not consistent. Real life is not perfect. Real life is flawed. You do have some areas that are more colorful than others. You do have some areas that are darker than others. Some areas where the light is hitting you more intensely, and other areas where the light is not hitting you as much. So I think, to me, that is the secret to unlocking, how do you make a painting look real? How do you make a painting look alive? It's by adding those variations and avoiding repetition or too much repetition. Another tip for rendering, I guess anything, but mostly for the body. The body has so many subtle, three-dimensional forms. And a trick that our teachers use is he'll over darken an area first and then use a lighter value on top of it to sculpt out the 3D form. So let's say I have a patch of cheek to work on. I will just find the correct midtone and apply the midtone throughout, even where the highlights are. And then the mid-tone area that actually is supposed to have a mid-tone, that I'll leave alone. But the mid-tone area that it needs to be brighter, I'll then go in with thicker, globbier, lighter paint and just apply it on top of that patch. I'm hoping I'm making sense. So it's like if I'm painting a spherical part of the face, like the cheek, where there's like a kind of an apple shape, to first apply the dark values accurately, apply all the mid-tone values accurately, and then instead of just leaving space for the highlights, I'll just go ahead and cover that space with the mid-tone first, and then put the highlights on top of the wet mid-tone paint. A reason to do this is, one, it saves time, and two, it kind of helps the paint automatically blend. So when you're working wet on wet and you apply, new paint onto previously applied paint, the two will naturally mix together, and it just helps make a more subtle transition from the midtones to highlights. And also it helps build up the body of the paint. Like I mentioned earlier in the tutorial, we want to keep the shadowy, darker values thin and airy. And in those areas, I'll use a bit more medium to thin out the paint. And then in the highlights and lighter values, you want more volume, more bulk. And so in those areas, I don't use as much medium. I just very carefully apply the lighter paint. And this kind of also brings me to my next point, which is about mediums, drying times, wet on wet. I guess this is all kind of one universal point I'm trying to make, which is don't be in a rush to get the paint to dry. I know that with a lot of people I've talked to who haven't tried oils, or people who are just starting out trying oils, one of their biggest fears or biggest gripes with the medium is that it takes too long to dry. But I'm going to explain to you why that's a good thing and why we shouldn't always try to urge the paint to dry faster, why we should kind of let it dry slow, and we like oil paint because it's drying slow. Also, just a side note here, as you can see, I'm shaving off parts of the top of the head. This is the part I was talking about in the beginning where I needed to fix some of my block-in issues. I realized at this point, after adding in some of the darker mid-tone and light values, that the head was looking way too long. So I had to shave it and flatten it a bit. Sometimes it's hard to tell the proportions, or it's hard to gauge the accuracy of your proportions until you lay in some value. So if you just do like an outline sketch, it might look correct. But then once you add the shadows, midtones, and highlights, even on a basic level, you'll be able to more accurately see some errors you made, just because it's easier to see how accurate like a proportion is of a head once you add in the 3D effect, right? It's hard to tell using a line drawing how accurate everything's going to look. But once things start looking somewhat 3D, and start inching closer to reality, then it's easier for you to compare your painting to your reference or to your source. So that's why I shaved the head so late. And even if you start off with like an accurate drawing and you spend a long time on the drawing, it doesn't guarantee that once you start painting that everything is going to look correct. So keep yourself open to the opportunities to continue to refine and perfect your proportions even as you're painting. But in general, there shouldn't be some glaring, terrible mistakes. Like you should still try to spend a lot of time in the initial stages planning the block-in to be as accurate as possible, so that when you do have to fix things, it's just like a light nudge or a small tweak. It doesn't have to be as dramatic, because as we know, it's really hard to dramatically alter things with oil paint and having to repaint mistakes. It's very frustrating. So yeah, back to what I was talking about before with the slow drying time of oil paint. This piece was painted over the course of 5 days, and I painted it like every single day, so back to back. And I am using paper, which is more absorbent, so my paint dried a lot faster than it would have if I used canvas. So that was a big plus with oil paper. But even then, you don't want to work on half dry paint. So with oils, like you want to work when the paint is freshly wet or when the paint has completely dried to the touch. So when it's freshly wet, then you can, lay paint on top of paint. You can use the wet on wet to blend out or soften edges. You can use it, like I mentioned before, the technique of integrating like a lighter value on top of a darker value and having them naturally blend and mix together on your painting. Those are all effects that are great for wet on wet. And also, when the paint is completely dry to the touch, then you can glaze. You can add in like a second layer and refine things or paint things on top of other things without worrying about muddying the colors. So those are the two opportunities you have where oil paint can interact best with itself. But when the paint is like half dry or partially dry, that's when it's the most dangerous, because you can accidentally lift off a patch of paint that maybe has already kind of congealed and has already connected or bonded with its surrounding paint, and you just end up lifting a whole patch off. And I've had that happen to me before. It's quite scary. But when the paint is like completely dry, you don't have to worry about it lifting off. It's already kind of dried and solidified onto your painting surface. And when the paint is freshly wet, instead of lifting off, it just kind of blends and integrates with the new paint. So you really want to avoid painting on half dry paint. So that's why I'm going from left to right. I'm just with each day I sit down, I know I have about 2 to 3 hours to finish that day's session. And I have to do a bit of planning, thinking about like, okay, if I'm going to do the left eye today, I want to finish it and get it pretty much complete so that the second day I can move on to the nose. And then maybe the third day I'll move on to the right eye. But I don't want to like hop around too much, because you want to get like one section finished and ready to go so you can move on to another section. That's kind of why it's called window shading. It's almost like you're shading a window. If you hop around too much, you're going to end up with a lot of areas that are maybe half dry, or you can't tell how dry they are because it's hard to remember when you last worked on a patch. So by almost, attacking your oil paint in a very mechanical, procedural way, I know it doesn't sound as fun, doesn't sound as like creative or whimsical, but having some structure, some organization in the process will help just make the painting go so much more smoothly. So for me, by using this window shading technique, I know that like it generally takes around 2 days for the paint to dry completely, or dry, I guess, within a safe margin of error. So like I'll paint the left eye, and over the next 2 days, I'll just do like the nose and the right eye. And then if I have something to fix on the left eye, I won't go back and fix it until I know it's completely dry. So like maybe the 4th or 5th day, I'll go back and fix the left eye. And by having this process, I can very easily keep track of how much something has dried. I'm going from left to right, top to bottom. So I know that like the leftmost part of my painting has a higher chance of being dry than something closer to the right side, because I've painted the left side first. And by doing that, I don't really have to even consciously think about or worry about the paint drying time. With each day, I give myself a specific section to work on, and within that section, I'm working wet on wet. I'm able to blend the colors more smoothly. I'm able to soften the edges more easily. And if I do need to go back and glaze or apply a second layer, I know that everything to the left of me is probably already dried, and then everything super far to the left of me is like completely dry. With a lot of artists, they actually use mediums that keep the painting wet for longer. So like a slow drying medium, they use that on purpose because they want the freedom to go back in and work on the painting. I think also a lot of the issues that new painters encounter with working wet on wet, and maybe why they always have this need to want the painting to dry, is because they find it very hard to apply wet paint on top of wet paint. And that to me is a very common issue I bump into, especially before I started training at school. I sometimes would find myself stuck and I want to keep painting. I have more energy, I have more time in the day, but I feel like I have to physically stop because all my paint is wet and I can't really work on it more. Like it just seems to be impossible to lay down new paint on top of this wet paint without things going wrong. And I think a major cause of that is not just due to the intrinsic slow drying nature of oils, but just due to needing to practice our paint application methods a bit more. So nowadays, if I'm working wet on wet, I rarely find myself encountering that problem of, oh my gosh, I can't apply new paint on top of old paint. It's because when you first lay down your initial pass of wet paint, you want to keep that pass fairly thin, like not too thin that, you can still see the paper or the panel underneath, but thin enough to give yourself some wiggle room for new paint on top of it during that same session. So if you first lay down a patch of paint that's way too thick, it's really hard to put new paint on top of it, because with the way that paint works, like if you have a thin layer initially and then you have a slightly thicker layer on top and then the thickest layer on top of that, the paint can stick together really well. And that's because usually when you're applying new paint on top of previous paint, it's because you want to change something, right? So let's say that I applied a patch on the forehead that was like way too dark and I want to lighten it. So if the patch of dark paint is thin, I can very easily overcome the power of that paint by using a thicker, higher volume application of lighter paint. Then the light can blend in and integrate with the darker paint and maybe even cover it up. Think of it as like color mixing. When you have a color that's too dark and you want to lighten it, you're going to mix a lighter color into that puddle. But if the puddle is already so big and so thick, then you're going to have to use so much more of the lighter paint to lighten that puddle. But if your puddle of dark paint is small and thin and doesn't have a lot of volume, it doesn't take as much new lighter paint to lighten that puddle. So I try to think of my painting itself the same way. The initial pass, I always am more careful and apply more thinly so that if I do need to change it or tweak it wet on wet style, I have many chances to lay down thicker globs of paint. And I would also recommend to be careful with your usage of mediums, because paint mediums, if you use too much of it, it's going to make the paint really slippery and viscous, and then it's hard for new paint to kind of like grip on top of it. So by actually using less medium, it's easier for me to just like layer paint on top of wet paint. And the whole discussion around mediums is its own can of worms, but I think it's important to state, every artist has their own technique. And so I don't want to tell you guys like, hey, don't use mediums just because I don't use mediums. Because I know that like my teacher, for example, he's known for using very like juicy, runny, thick applications of mediums, and he knows how to make it work for his own style. But for me, I find it way easier to control the paint if I don't have a lot of mediums. So mediums are great for integrating into kind of tacky, semi-dried paint. It gives it some more life. It makes it easier to spread, easier to work with, but also using too much medium can make the paint more difficult to work with. So what I try to do is I try to use as little medium as possible. If I find a pile of paint has kind of semi-dried on my palette and it's getting really tacky, like kind of like taffy texture or toothpaste texture, then I'll put in a little bit of medium just to make that paint easier to spread. But if the paint on my palette is too dry, where I have to then use so much medium to combat its dryness, then I know it's time for me just to discard that puddle of paint and mix new fresh paint out of the tube. That's something that my teacher is like one of his pet peeves. All of the students, we don't like wasting paint. Oil paint is expensive, and also we just don't like the idea of throwing away good paint. Like we want to use it. And he keeps encouraging us like, hey, if your paint is hard to work with and has already kind of past the point of no return in terms of it's dry, it's congealed, it's not easy to spread anymore, just throw it away. Just mix new paint, because trying to work with semi-dried, tacky paint is only going to give you more problems on your painting. And it's just not worth it. Yes, you might waste a little bit of paint, but would you rather like waste a little bit of paint, or just create a whole bunch of problems for yourself on the painting and spend so much more time and stress trying to fix that? So that's something that I'm still, training myself to get better at, is being able to detect when the paint on my palette is not fresh enough. And usually with paint that's fresh and, juicy and wet, you don't really have to use a lot of medium to get it to be easy to work with. It's already easy to work with by nature. So, just pay attention to, refreshing the paint that's on your palette, and don't be afraid to get rid of colors that are used and difficult to paint with. I would say like my technique is just, I don't squeeze out too much paint onto my palette to begin with. I try to keep those paint dollops small. That way, if it does dry and I do have to throw it away, I'm not throwing away a lot of paint. I know a lot of our teachers throughout the years, they just squeeze so much paint out of the tube onto their palette. And even if it's just like one day, they don't want to reuse it. They just throw away like giant globs of fresh paint because they don't want to even deal with the hassle of slightly dry paint. And I think once you get to a certain skill level, those small differences are more palpable to you and more noticeable. For me right now, I like to store my leftover paint in the freezer. Like I put it into this document container. It's basically like a very flat piece of Tupperware. I tape like a piece of palette paper to the bottom, and then I just scoop the paint off of my palette onto this container, and then I close the lid and I put it in my freezer, and that can prolong the lifespan of my paint. I have some teachers who will only do that for like once or twice before they refresh the paint, and I have other teachers who don't do that at all. They just throw away all the paint on their palette at the end of the day, which to me is, I don't think I'll ever be able to do that. It's just too wasteful and I get too sad. So by reducing the need for mediums, and by reducing just the amount of medium you use in general, I find it's way easier to work wet on wet. So it sounds like I went on a long tangent, but I'm looping back to my initial point, which is like, don't be afraid of the slow drying nature of oils. Utilize that, harness that. That is the advantage of oils, that it's the power of oils. That's what makes it, in my opinion, a stronger, more versatile medium than the other mediums. As long as the paint is wet, then it's still malleable, it's still changeable. You can blend it, you can soften it, you can layer paint on top of it. Once the paint has dried, it becomes a lot more difficult to make those small tweaks and subtle changes. It's still possible, but it's just not as satisfying or not as straightforward as working wet on wet. So yeah, with oils and with being trained at this atelier, it really opened my eyes to, like, instead of always trying to combat the wetness, I should instead lean into it and take advantage of it, because it's a strength, not a weakness of oils, is how slow it is to dry. Being at art school also helped me change the way I view like layers. A lot of times people ask me, how many layers did this take? Or how many layers do you usually need, to finish a painting? And in school, they rarely use the word layers. And instead they use the word pass, like how many passes. And with our teachers, they usually don't need more than 2 passes. So the difference between layers and passes, normally I don't actually care about like the vernacular or defining certain terms. I feel like painting should be just an intuitive physical process. It doesn't really matter what each definition of each process is. All we're doing is painting, except when it comes to layers and pass. Those are the only terms that I actually care about, because it's changed the way that I see the painting process. So, when we say like one layer, what I used to mean was like not one physical paint layer, but like one session kind of, right? Like one wet application of the paint. And then once that application has dried and I layer a second layer on top of it, that to me is like a second layer. But I think by using the term layers, we're almost falsely convincing ourselves that when we're working wet on wet, there can only be like one physical layer of paint. And that's not true. So instead we use the word pass. And pass means what I thought layers meant, was like one wet on wet application, and you're working on it until it dries. And after it dries, the first pass is over. But while it's still wet, it's still within like the first pass. And within that first pass, there can be multiple layers. Working wet on wet, by nature, we're layering wet paint on top of wet paint. And that's what builds up the volume. That's what creates those soft blended edges. So I try to use the word pass instead of layer now. So in this case, like I've finished the primary pass where everything, like I've done like 4 or so sessions. Each session I work wet on wet, and now all of them have dried. And so on the last day, the Friday of this pose, I went in and I touched everything. It was all dry to the touch. And I very carefully now used a clean brush with just my medium. My medium is Oleo Res Gel, which is a slow drying medium. Oleo Res Gel, a fast drying medium, mixed with linseed oil, a slow drying medium. So I mix the two together and they create this like really satisfying kind of gelatinous, gooey, clear paste. And I don't know if you can tell on the screen right now, but I'm just applying a thin wash of the medium over this completely dried paint. And what that does is it makes everything wet again. It doesn't reactivate the paint. So I'm not smearing stuff around. It's at this point, the paint has been completely absorbed into the paper. It's dry to the touch. And I'm very carefully just coating it with a layer of this wet medium. And this is a process called oiling out. So the benefit of oiling out is one, and just because it's not noticeable on the screen doesn't mean it's not noticeable in real life, but sometimes when your paint dries, especially if you're using panels like wood panels or paper, the surface can absorb the paint into it. So instead of the paint sitting on top, it gets absorbed into the surface. And once it gets absorbed inside the surface, it dries kind of matte. So you'll notice that a lot of the like dark, rich shadows might end up looking kind of grayed out and lighter in value. This is what they call sunken in. So when a part of a painting is sunken in, is basically it means it's been absorbed into the surface and dried kind of matte, and the value kind of lightens. That's dangerous because so much of, when you're working realistically and working with so much nuance and subtlety, these small differences in value really matter. So when you see a patch that's lighter in value, it might throw off your entire value spectrum. So like I noticed the side of the face, or like especially the shadow under the nose, like cast by the nose onto the mustache, I noticed that it looked a lot lighter than before. And if it looks lighter, it might trick my eyes into thinking like, oh, maybe the beard needs to be lighter because, in the ranking of the value hierarchy, like the shadow on the beard needs to be significantly darker than the highlights on the beard. So if I see that the shadow of the beard has lightened, it might trick me into thinking, oh, I need to lighten those highlights even more. When in reality, the shadow is still the accurate color that I had once put down. It's simply been absorbed and sunken in. So by putting my clear medium, it's almost like a varnishing process. By coating that patch with the medium, I'm able to reinvigorate that patch and bring out that dark value once again. So it is very similar to varnishing. You know how varnishing makes everything kind of come to life. It makes the highlights brighter. It makes the dark values darker. That's kind of what I'm doing by applying this oiling out layer with just the clear medium. I'm able to bring back the darknesses of all the dark values. And then when I go in to finesse things on top, I can have an accurate starting point. I don't have to repaint things that aren't necessary. In the past, when everything's sunken in, I just thought, oh, I need to repaint this. I must have not painted it as dark as I needed it to be at first. And I end up repainting areas that were actually pretty accurate to begin with. I just couldn't see it because it was absorbed and sunken in. And With the primary pass, I try to get everything as finished as possible. Our teachers say, like, push yourself, like, try to aim for like 100% perfection and completion on the primary pass. We probably won't get there, but let's aim for it. And what ends up happening is you usually get to be like 80 or 90% of the way there. And the second pass, once you've oiled out, is perfect for glazing. And glazing is a method of, you have a slippery, wet, oiled out surface to begin with. And when you put paint on top of that slippery surface, it's not going to be 100% opaque. It's going to be semi-transparent. And that's where you have a lot of control over nudging these subtleties. So as you can see here with this glaze, what I'm doing is just bringing out some of the highlights, maybe refining some of those wrinkles, adding in a pop of chroma. Glazing is perfect for tweaking the colors. So like in the corners of the eye or on the bridge of the nose where you have a dark value transitioning to a midtone, those are great areas where you can fit in a small band of chroma. So I mix like almost like a perfect orange, and I'm adding in that into the areas where dark shadows transition into slightly lighter midtones. You'll see it kind of on the left eye bag wrinkle, and also on the wrinkles on his nose bridge. I just love fitting in those small pops of color because it makes the subject feel alive. And kind of what I mentioned before, you don't want color spread throughout too consistently where there's color everywhere and they're all fighting for attention. You want mostly muted neutral colors with small accents of high chroma areas, so that they can stand out. Or like on the cheek, I didn't make the entire cheek super red, but I found an area where like the wrinkle on the nose, I think they're called the actually, I don't know what they're called. I don't know the scientific term, but yeah, the smile lines, the areas where the nose causes a wrinkle in the cheek, that transition between the dark black wrinkle to like the mid-tone kind of brownish cheek, I just squeezed in a little pop of the rosy red. So yeah, the secondary pass is my favorite. It's where I think I've done the bulk of the work and the bulk of the problem solving. And this secondary pass is just for refinement and polish. It's like the sprinkle on top of the sundae. All the anatomy looks correct, all the proportions, the perspective looks good, the composition is finalized. And now it's just time for me to indulge in all of my perfectionist tendencies and try to get the painting to look as perfect and as beautiful as possible. And yeah, it's just my favorite. But hopefully, as we wrap up this tutorial, I was able to impart some useful knowledge. I know I tend to ramble on, so hopefully I made sense. And if you all have any questions or need clarification, feel free to comment on the post or message me on Patreon or email me, just reach me in any way you can. And I'll try my best to explain myself more clearly. But yeah, and then on a last note, I just loved painting this model. His name is Randy. He is in his 80s and he has been modeling for art schools, for many decades. So actually not just in Seattle, but I think a lot of artists just know who he is because a lot of people have painted him. My teacher has painted him like 15, 20 years ago, back when Randy had dark gray hair and was, just a younger lad. And so for us, it was just such an honor to be able to paint him. He looks like he stepped right out of a Renaissance painting. Every wrinkle tells a story. Like, he's so expressive and so timeless. I felt like I was painting like a wizard or a sorcerer or a king. Like, there's so many characters that he can play. And I was just in such a good mood painting him. And I had been wanting to paint his portrait since he posed for us last year, like when I was a drawing student. He did a quick like 1 or 2 day pose for us. And I just kept thinking like, God, I want him back for a longer pose and I want to paint his face. He only posed for us like once or twice for a quick like 1 day body pose. And I was like, this guy has like the best face ever. So I was very lucky to be able to chat with him during breaks, and he is also taking a beginning oil painting class, which just shows that you're never too old to pick up something new, to, you know, indulge in your creative hobbies and strive for your goals. So he was just so inspiring. And I even told him, I'm like, you're so lucky, Randy. You get to paint Randy whenever you want. Because he showed us a self-portrait he did that was, you know, absolutely beautiful. And I was like, yeah, the rest of us, we're all hoping and pining that you come pose for us, but you can paint yourself whenever you want. And he laughed. So yeah. Anyways, we are wrapping up the tutorial now. Thank you all so much for watching and for your support on Patreon, and for continuing to allow me to do what I love and share it with you all and share art with the world. You know, words cannot express just how grateful I am to have you all not just support me, but kind of be alongside of me for this art school journey. And I'm hoping I can continue to pass on any knowledge I learned from school. So yeah, I love you all. Take care, and I'll see you next month. Bye.